we're going to get started here with the keynote portion, and to introduce, no, we're going to have Lenny introduce us. You always introduce. I always do it on the map.
Right, yeah. All right, wow. It was so hard to get everybody quieted for the lightning talk rounds, and now you're excited to hear Janet talk. So thank you all for coming to the UMN Spatial Forum again. I just have the simple task of introducing Dr. Robert McMaster, professor in Geography, Environment, and Society, who will be introducing our keynote speaker.
And hopefully I'm not missing any pages on this. Well, good afternoon. This time I'll introduce myself, Bob McMaster. I'm a faculty member in the Geography Department. Today I'm pleased to be able to welcome you to this year's John Borchert Lecture and to introduce this year's speaker, Professor Janet Franklin. Each year we are fortunate that members of the Borchert family are able to join us for this lecture. And I'm pleased to acknowledge, if I have the lineup correct today, Bill Borchert, Bob and Barb Borchert, Dave and Pat Borchert, and my understanding is there's some additional family members here. Could you raise your hand? I assume you know the secret Borchert handshake. Okay. Before I take leave of this place, I really would like to see your sister Diane at one of these, but we'll cross our fingers. As you know, the Borchert Lecture this year is part of the department's 100-year celebration. 100 years ago, our founding fathers were starting our department over in Burton Hall, which was the original university library. And here we are in the library again. As part of this year's celebration, we've created a new Centennial Fund to support our department and students, and we've already received some generous gifts that we wanted to acknowledge for this and our Borchert Library Fund as well. Most recently from our alumnus, Will Craig, who I know is here today. If you're interested in this fund and support, there's some flyers over there. And it's a great way to support the department. But in the meantime, where is Will? Will, could you come up here for just one moment? I'll meet you halfway. Wanted to give you this 100th anniversary mark.
How big is the minimum contribution to get one of these?
There's a fundraiser.
John Borchert was a very special colleague of ours. Most of us know that. And believe it or not, this is now the 19th John Borchert Lecture in Geographic Information Science. Our first was in the spring of 2008. And I used to list all the Borchert speakers who had given this, but there's too many now. So I'm just going to mention the inaugural speaker who came in 2008, and that was Jack Dangermont, president of ESRI. When talking about John Borchert, and I said a word or two about him in the 100th talk that I just gave, I used to say, as most of you know. But given the changes at the university, I know I should now say, perhaps, as some of you know, or as a few of you might know, John Borchert was one of the intellectual fathers of our geography department, and he had a great love of maps and spatial information. In fact, because of his great interest in cartography and spatial information, our internationally recognized map library was named the Borchert Map Library in May of 1989. John Borchert was one of the most influential geographers of the 20th century. Educated in geology at DePauw University and having completed a PhD with a focus in climatology from, I'm afraid to say, the University of Wisconsin, he turned his keen mind to human settlement patterns and urban geography. A Regents professor and a member of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the very first geographers named to the National Academy. John was a member of the geography faculty for 40 years from 1949 to 1989, with a career that intellectually spanned the discipline from biophysical geography to urban geography. But his work was always maintained a constant focus on the map as the obligatory tool of our profession. It was another influential Minnesota geographer, Yifu Tuan, who wrote, this is terrific, "In a period of intellectual flux, when geography seems tempted to follow the non-geographical sirens of transient glamour, John Borchert always manages to anchor the discipline's sense of identity on the rock of cartographic information." Several of John's last projects focus on the upper Middle West and Minnesota. His seminal book, America's Northern Heartland, An Economic and Historical Geography of the Upper Middle West, was published in 1987. It's a terrific book. And his video series for public TV, The Geography of Minnesota, appeared in the early 1990s. Okay. I remember well sitting in on John's Geography of Minnesota class during the 1990-91 academic year to hear what he had to say about Minnesota. It was just a terrific course, and I could have not had any better preparation for my new life in Minnesota. Thus, John remained very active in his research after his retirement and passed away in the spring of 2001. There's a great website that documents his history and accomplishments and legacy. You just have to ping John Borchert and you'll find it. So in 2008, again, given his signature contributions to our department and remarkable achievements in the field of geography and his great love of geography and maps, the University of Minnesota named this GIS lecture series in honor of him. This year, we're delighted that Professor Janet Franklin, Endowed Campanile Foundation Professor of Geography in the Center for Open Geospatial Sciences and the Department of Geography, San Diego State University, has joined us for this lecture. She's a perfect fit for the Borchert Lecture. Janet was previously a distinguished professor in the Department of Botany, University of California, Riverside, a Regents Professor in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning, as well as a distinguished sustainability scientist at Arizona State University, where she was appointed in 2009. From 1988 to 2009, she was an assistant associate and full professor on the faculties of geography and biology at San Diego State University. She received her PhD in geography from the University of California, Santa Barbara, one of our very famous geography departments, in 1988, and her research experience is in landscape ecology, global change biology, conservation biogeography, and geospatial science. Janet's scholarship seeks to understand the patterns and dynamics of terrestrial land plant communities at the landscape scale, and her work addresses the impacts of human-caused landscape change on the environment and biological diversity. Janet is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, like John, fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Ecological Society of America. She is an associate member of the Center for Coastal Paleoscience, Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. She has published over 175 refereed articles and received many, many research grants to support her work. And her book, Mapping Species Distributions, Spatial Inference and Prediction, Cambridge University Press, has been cited over 3,000 times. This afternoon, Janet will be speaking on Where We Became Human, Mapping the Middle Stone Age on the South African Coast. I also have the same gift for Janet Franklin. Please help me welcome Janet Franklin of San Diego State University.
All right. Thank you, Bob, for that very thorough introduction. And thank you all for being here and for letting me be part of this confluence of three amazing events: Geography Week and the Borchert Lecture and this 100th anniversary celebration and series. So I'm especially honored to be giving the Borchert Lecture. Professor Borchert would have retired the year after I got my PhD. I never had the pleasure of meeting him, but I read on the website that when he started out, he taught geography of natural resources, and so did I. So I stand on the shoulders of a giant. So I am talking today about a project that really sparks my passion, and it sort of addresses the original place-based human-environment interactions. I'm going to tell a story of becoming human in a specific natural environment of the African South Coast, and I hope it will engage you as much as it has me for the past 12 years, because who doesn't want to hear a story about all of us? So I want to acknowledge that this work is a contribution of the African Center for Coastal Paleoscience, whose mission is to conduct quaternary paleoscientific research in an interdisciplinary context on the south coast of South Africa. And this is nothing if not interdisciplinary. And I also want to, in addition to acknowledging funding from the National Science Foundation, introduce just a few of my collaborators that on the current phase of the work that I'll be talking about today, especially Dr. Brooke Rose, who's from my research group, who implemented the vegetation model that I'll be talking about today. Haley Kothra, a geoscientist who can explain geology so that even I understand it. Curtis Marion is a paleoanthropologist and is the principal investigator of the Pinnacle Points sites that I'll be talking about today, where he has been excavating for more than 2 decades. And Professor Richard Cowling is a brilliant guru of plant ecology, botany, biogeography, and evolutionary ecology, everything about plants of South Africa. So what I want to talk about today is first give a little context about, because most of the things I'm talking about are things I don't have much expertise in. That's what we love about interdisciplinary. So I'll have to bring you up to speed as I had to myself on modern human origins and what is meant by human behavioral modernity, and when exactly is the Middle Stone Age, and what's special about the Cape region of South Africa, and specifically the Cape South Coast. I'll give you some background about the evidence of behavioral modernity, once we know what that is, from the archaeology at these sites. And then I'll talk about our work trying to understand how the landscape changed as the climate changed during the Middle Stone Age, so basically during the later Pleistocene, and how that affected resource patterns for the people who lived there. So we refer to that as a resource paleoscape model or a resource paleo landscape that we're trying to reconstruct. And I'll specifically talk about vegetation, because that's my thing, terrestrial plants. And then I'll conclude sort of with reflections on our human origins in a biodiversity hotspot. So this recent paper in Nature, with which is as technical as the title makes it sound, revealed a deep ancestral genetic structure shared by all modern humans. And so their figure shows this simplified model of human demographic history, showing this deep structure, the area in red, from about 1.5 million years ago to about 300,000 years ago, that's shared by all present-day humans. So anatomically anatomically humans, or Homo sapiens, our species originated about 300,000 years ago. The present-day Khoisan people who live in southern Africa are genetically most similar to and direct descendants of the people who lived in the caves, who we'll be talking about today. And so they and all of us are descendants of the people who occupied the archaeological sites. And so this is the African modern human lineage. So anthropologists also refer to modern human behavior. And so behavioral modern humans are defined by things like evidence of advanced cognition, hyperprosociality, which means a proclivity to cooperate with people who you are not directly related to, or other individuals that are you're not directly related to, which other animals don't do. And a psychology for social learning. So don't worry about the details here, but this is a timeline showing in thousands of years, back to about 200,000 years, when the earliest evidence of different indicators of behavioral modernity emerged. And so it's always hard to find the oldest thing if you're an archaeologist, because you don't know until you found it. But so for a long time, it was thought that this evidence emerged maybe 50,000 years ago. But you'll see that these sites in South Africa push this evidence back to almost 200,000 years ago. These are things like symbolic art, advanced tool usage, complex recipe technology. So, and on the timeline on the top, it also shows kind of a global temperature graph, warm on the top, cold on the bottom, that spans this period of the last 200,000 years. So let's look at another version, not a particularly pretty one, but at least a little easier to see. And so we can learn a little bit more jargon from some of the other specialists that we work with, the paleoclimate folks. When these folks study what we would call the ice ages, right, the Pleistocene, the million or 2 years where the Earth was going in and out of ice ages. So in order to track global temperature, the evidence that's often used is stable isotopes, oxygen isotopes that occur in sediment cores from the ocean. And so so that's what we're seeing here is a global temperature proxy, which are from marine isotopes. So as the organisms in the ocean, as the temperature changes, the chemistry of those organisms changes, and then when you fall to the bottom and become part of the sediment, they leave a signature. They leave a chemical signature, which is a temperature signature. So we're just seeing, so what we would refer to as glacials and interglacials, these people call the marine isotope stages. So if I lapse and use that term, you'll know what I'm talking about. So marine isotope stage 1 is the Holocene. It's the period we're in now. It's warm. The temperature is up. And in the blue stripes are the cold. So the less glacial maximum is the one most people around here will be familiar with when we were under how much ice where we're standing. But we're going to be interested in these periods from, say, 50 to 200,000 years ago, where you can see there were glacials and interglacials. They weren't quite as strong until you get to the interglacial at 5e and the strong glacial at marine isotope stage 6. Okay, so sort of keep those things in mind. And then, finally, what is the Middle Stone Age? So this is defined by artifacts, by archaeologists, as indicated by the types of stone tools that were made, and the African Middle Stone Age is generally defined as from about 300,000 years ago to about 40,000 years ago. So basically, that is the time when since we have become anatomically, genetically, and behaviorally modern. So those other artifacts shown here going back to 3 million years ago in East Africa were made by other hominin species. And then one more thing we need to know is a little bit about the South African Cape. If you're not familiar with it. So this small area on the south west coast of Africa is called the Cape Floristic region or the Cape Floral Kingdom, because that area that's delineated there has one of the world's most biodiverse and unique floras. There are over 9,500 species of plants that occur there. 70% of them are endemic. They only occur in that area and nowhere else on Earth. And that's 20% of the flora of Africa in 1 or 2% of the land area. So it's very much a biodiversity hotspot. And so our human origins are rooted in this biodiversity hotspot, highest plant diversity on Earth outside of the wet tropical rainforests. And these are just a few examples from one of the plant communities, the feinbos, which I'll mention again later. Okay, so I'm going to be, so here's that Cape region again. It's funny, and I'm going to be focusing on this area called the Cape South Coast. So this is actually Cape Town over here. The blue line on this map that's indicated in gray over here shows the extent of a fairly, this will be important in our story, a fairly shallow coastal shelf off the coast there that extends fairly far right around Cape Agulhas, which is currently the southernmost point of Africa. And so we have referred to this as the Paleo-Agulhas Plain. The gray line indicates about the 120 or 130 meter isobath. So during the strong glacial periods, like during the last glacial maximum, you have to keep in mind that sea level was 120 meters lower than it is today. We will talk again in a minute about the Paleo-Agulhas Plain. These locations are on the south coast are different important archaeological sites. And I'm going to focus on Pinnacle Point here. So this Pinnacle Point complex consists of several caves and rock shelters. I'll be referring to some of them. The archaeology that we're going to talk about came from PP13B and PP56. The current land use sitting on top of these cliffs is a golf resort. So why are these sites important in the archaeological record in South Africa during spanning the Middle Stone Age? So these Pinnacle Point sites are shown in red, and in purple are some other important archaeological sites in South Africa. So this is a timeline going from 40 down to 180,000 years ago. So the Pinnacle Point sites extend the record further towards the present, 40,000 years ago. They basically span most of the Middle Stone Age, and especially extend that record backward with a gap back to almost 170,000 years ago. So right back into that marine isotope stage 6, when we had another strong glaciation. And there's our, our temperature line again. Okay, so what gets archaeologists, paleoanthropologists so excited about these places? It's remarkable that their findings extend the record of evidence for modern human behaviors back to, in this case, 162,000 years ago. So we'll start with coastal foraging. Shellfish in the intertidal. If you're exploiting shellfish from the lower intertidal, like really good stuff like abalone, you need to be able to predict tides, right? You need to be able to anticipate the twice a month when you have spring tides, the highest and lowest of the tides during the full and new moon. You need to know when that's coming. Baboons forage in the intertidal. They do not forage in the lower intertidal. So humans can do that, other primates cannot. And so throughout this talk, I want to use these beautiful scientific illustrations by Maggie Newman that she produced for the African Center for Coastal Paleosciences, because they're a bit more compelling as well as being very detailed and accurate of illustrations of how people were making a living. Another earliest evidence they found was use of pigments. So ochre is an iron-rich clay mineral. It ranges in color. Ochre really kind of refers to the color of this kind of deep orange. It actually can come from various sources, I'm told, with varying mineralogies. It's not a single rock type. But this is earliest evidence of humans using pigments, which is used for symbolic artifacts, for marking, for painting on rocks, for painting on bodies, as well as it's used as a preservative. This is from another site, Chris Henshelwood at Blombos Cave at 100,000 years ago, but a similar thing was found at Pinnacle Point, where the ochre was found in a container, an abalone shell, earliest use of containers, with a grinding rock, which is pretty cool. And so here's an illustration of the use of ochre. Moving on to the next innovation, this area although it was, it's rich in a lot of resources, as we're seeing, but there was not a lot of chert or flint or obsidian or kinds of rock that are apparently really good for flaking and making stone tools and weapons. And so what they have found in the site is heat-treated silkrete. So silkrete is a kind of rock that's, I guess, not that hard, doesn't flake that well unless you heat it. And so, and then it becomes kind of hardened and is much better for making things like this. So this recipe, because of course you know how archaeologists are, they try to copy stuff, right, that they find, see if they can replicate it. You have to use a low heat for a really long time, only about 300 degrees Fahrenheit and blah, blah, blah. So this is, they say this is evidence of a complex recipe technology. This would have been shared between people. You'd have to have, good ways of communicating verbally. It'd be passed down for generations and so forth. And so it requires a lot of firewood. So here's another resource that's needed from the landscape. And here's an illustration of collecting firewood. The firewood could be very easily collected from, say, these shrublands, like the Feinboss shrublands, following natural wildfire. These are areas that have a sort of a natural fire ecology, wildfire regime. And in addition to collecting firewood in the illustration, it's also a lot easier to find plant foods after a wildfire, and these plant foods, things with underground storage organs, so tubers and bulbs, are extremely diverse and abundant in this Cape Floral Kingdom. So, it's in addition to the archaeology, there is unfortunately not a lot of other evidence about the terrestrial landscapes. Like, wouldn't we like to have a sediment core with pollen or something like that, so you can reconstruct, have some direct evidence of changes in the flora and fauna and stuff like that. So there's not very many of those. But another kind of basically fossil evidence that they do have are trackways. These trackways are preserved in aeolianites. These are rocks formed from coastal dunes that have then been cemented with calcium carbonate. And these are fossil footprints and other impressions left by plants and animals, such as this dune mole rat burrow being shown by Dr. Jan de Vink, who worked with Dr. Charles Helm, who just has discovered and described over 900 trackways now of all kinds of things. And then by dating the rock, you know when that the animal was there. So for example, these are tracks of a large herbivore. I believe it's an elephant. So there are no elephants in the in that area today, but so if you know who was there and you know when they were there and you know what kind of habitats they required, so things like giraffe. This is actually a temperate corner of Africa. It doesn't have the tropical climate or tropical savanna that has, at the present, that has these kind of animals. But there is evidence in the past from these trackways, as well as some as faunal remains in the archaeology, that they were here at various times in the past. And just as an aside, when I was there in July, I was able to visit this trackway that was revealed by a storm. See, these are, as the rock broke away during a big storm in 2023. So you can see these fossils are very ephemeral, right? The next big storm could take this away. These are those elephant footprints that I showed you before. But if we zoom in on this ledge down here, we can see footprints that have, let me point them out to you, footprints that have been identified as human prints, and specifically two children walking together, and they're using a walking stick. So these are actually fossil impressions of their walking stick. So it still gives me chills to have seen that. And this is, the rock has been dated to 90,000 years ago. So we're building a picture of this resource-rich environment in which our ancestors walked. But those resources also should have fluctuated, right, as the world went in and out of the ice ages in this late Pleistocene period corresponding to the Middle Stone Age. So one of the resources that came and went was the land itself, as the proximity of the shore changed with sea level. And so that's going to affect where those important coastal resources are, but also what kinds of shorelines are exposed, which then corresponds to like what kinds of shellfish are there and when. So to reiterate, because of this shallow coastal shelf that's really wide around Cape Agulhas, the exposed landmass at, say, last glacial maximum in southern Africa was about the size of Ireland and doubled the landmass of the region. So a very different landscape. So if this is the current view from one of the caves that was excavated, or rock shelters at Pinnacle Point, this is what it looks like today, and it would have probably looked similar at past periods with sea level close to what it is today. But then during low sea stand, the occupants of the cave would have looked out on a wide, flat plain that could, be anywhere from 5 to 25 kilometers wide until you could reach the ocean. And this Paleoagulhas plain, it was a plain, and so it's been mapped by our geologist, Dr. Kothra. It would have had meandering wide floodplain rivers, so it would have supported grasslands and ungulate grazers that don't occur in the area today. So our human foragers developed advanced cognition, a psychology for social learning, and this hyperprosociality. They would have had options in their resource landscape, right? And those would have changed after time. But we know that they persisted and even thrived through these interglacial cycles, which literally changed the ground under their feet. So we're trying to fill in that picture of what did that look like. So this is where the biogeographers or the modelers come in. So an important first thing to recall, and also how do we persist there? That during the strong glacials, the entire rest of Africa, remember, all humans were, before, if we go back to the, past 50,000 years, the only humans around were all on the continent of Africa. And that continent of Africa got really dry during strong glacial periods and got pretty cold other places. But in fact, the south coast of South Africa didn't get that much colder. So this is a strong glacial period, the last glacial maximum. This is a temperature difference map that says how much colder was it at last glacial maximum than it is now. Globally, the average temperature was 6 degrees Celsius colder, which is about 11 degrees Fahrenheit. But we can see that it was way colder up near the ice caps, right, in the high latitudes, where it was maybe as much as 12 to 14 degrees Celsius colder on average. But in fact, the south coast of South Africa was only about 2 or 3 degrees Celsius colder on average. So not as nearly as dramatic a change. This is because it's really, that difference is really ameliorated by a mild maritime climate, and we have a cold ocean current going up the west coast of Africa, but we have a warm ocean current coming down the east coast. And so that warm Agulhas plain current also kept things warmer because it got closer to the coast, the south coast, when there was more south coast, when sea level was lower. So what did change? So now zeroing in on our region, rainfall and rainfall seasonality changed. So here's the area I'm going to be focusing on again, and what we can see here is trying to illustrate a couple things. On the west coast of South Africa, you have the cross-hatching shows winter-dominated rain. So that's a Mediterranean climate, type climate, and this is a Mediterranean climate ecosystem. So it has that strong winter rain, summer drought pattern that's the same as in all the Mediterranean climate regions, which occur on the west coasts of continents with adjacent cold ocean currents. So California, Chile, the Mediterranean, West Africa, or West Australia, Southwest Australia, and West and South West Africa. So the strongest winter rain pattern is on the west coast, and it persists over time. But there's this diagonal lines here encompass this south coast that we're interested in. Oh, and also the most extreme off the charts by plant diversity is in that winter rain region. On the south coast, there's actually a year-round rainfall pattern. And so it might be 60-40, 40-60, but they get rainfall in most months of the year. Then as you move out of the Cape region, the rest of Africa of southern Africa is a more typical tropical summer rain system. And so we're sort of in this tension zone here with year-round rainfall. And so what really changes in our reconstructions is, of course, the land area. So we can, if you can see there, in the cold periods, the sea level goes down, so the land area inside the box gets much bigger, and then it sort of varies a little bit during this sort of Middle Stone Age period that we're interested in. This graph is going all the way back to 400,000 years ago. Also, during those glacial periods, we can see this huge drop in the second graph, and that's mean annual precipitation. So like much of Africa, it did get much more arid. But again, the fluctuations were a lot more subtle in the Middle Stone Age period corresponding to the archaeology. But what's also interesting, in addition to getting, in fact, the kind of most coherent signal here is in the seasonality of precipitation. So typically in glacials, that south coast would get a lot more aseasonal rainfall, a lower percent of winter precipitation, and more year-round or even more summer precipitation. Okay, so why this matters, so hold that thought. So now what do we want to do? What we want to do is reconstruct the resource paleo landscape that would have occurred in that region at various times over that Middle Stone Age period. So you know, resources can include things like game animals and food plants, but also things like firewood and lithics for raw materials. So we want to model or develop paleo distribution maps of elements of the landscape that were sources of those resources. So things like vegetation, geology, and coastline. So in the case of vegetation, our paleo distribution models have to be linked to the climate changes that occurred. And to link them in the fine print here, you have some kind of a transfer function. So we want to know, the archaeologists want to know what were the return rates for a particular resource in a particular area for a gatherer or a hunter at that time. And so how do you do that? You do it from ethnographic. How do you calculate that? You can do foraging experiments, which is in fact what they do. And so once we've done this, we could, my colleagues could example use something like agent-based modeling to conduct experiments in the computer to answer questions about how our ancestors moved around that landscape and compare that against the archaeological record, which only contains these snapshots, and ask questions about things like foraging behavior or population density, population bottlenecks, group size, mobility, people becoming more mobile or less mobile at different times. So that's next steps. I'm not going to talk about any of that today. I'm just going to focus in on what our lab contributed to this, which was reconstructing these vegetation landscapes. And so to do that, we used a global climate data set along with terrestrial and offshore geologic mapping and an expert rule-based model to predict these plant communities from thresholds of those variables. So I'll just mention this climate data set. This was just recently published. It's a paleoclimate reconstruction from global climate models, and it has been made very accessible to researchers like me who are not climate modelers, as it maps terrestrial climate for the last 800,000 years in 1,000-year time steps. It's at about half-degree resolution or 50 kilometers. And it has, what I'm showing here is we're stepping back in time and seeing both the land area change, but also the precipitation go from, high to low. And we are very fortunate to have, and that's fairly coarse resolution, but I guess we're lucky in a sense that the vegetation patterns in this region are very strongly driven by geology and soil. So even though we have only coarse resolution reconstructions of climate, we have pretty high resolution reconstructions of geology, and then Dr. Haley Cothra has derived these sort of soil categories from her onshore and offshore mapping that are then used to predict vegetation patterns. So we use soil type, rainfall amount, rainfall seasonality, and fire refugia to predict the distribution of 14 vegetation types. I'll just mention a few of them here, or illustrate a few of them here. So Renosterveld is sort of a sub-shrub plant community that occurs especially on very fertile shale soils. So in fact, most of it's highly fragmented. It's a very endangered plant community because most of it has been converted to first grazing and then agriculture, a lot of canola fields in the last, over the last 500 years. Grasslands also occur on those fertile shale soils, but under a summer rainfall regime. So Renosterveld, more winter rain, grassland, more summer rain. Feinboss, this beautiful, iconic, tall, sclerophyll, leathery-leaved, evergreen shrub community that is especially rich in this unique flora. The giant proteas is famous for that. They tend to occur on infertile, shallow soils, so they tolerate these real infertile, on quartzite and things like that. And then dune feinboss thicket mosaic is basically a strandveld, a coastal strand vegetation, which in most parts of the world are not terribly botanically rich, but they are kind of off the charts rich in biodiversity and especially in food plants. So they kind of maybe all look the same to the untrained eye, but there's zero overlap in plant species community composition, the species that are there between these communities. Okay, so now I'm going to show an animation of our vegetation maps. We're stepping back through time from the present to 160,000 years ago. So I'll just point out a few things as this runs. One, there's some bright red, and that is sandstone feinboss, and also the pink is sand feinboss. So those are very stable through time. They just sort of stay there, right? What we see changing is this dynamic between light yellow and lavender. The lavender is the Renosterveld, and the light yellow is grassland. And so they kind of replace each other as we change from a more summer rain to more winter rain or year-round rain dominated. And then there's some, kind of, this brick color pops up at really low sea level. So remember, strong glacial periods, you get a lot of land exposed, but it gets real dry, right? And so those are actually the Nama Karoo and Succulent Karoo. Karoo are desert vegetation types that hardly occur within that area today, but are found nearby, a little bit to the interior. Okay, so this is, not to make you dizzy with this, I'll just try to summarize it with this bar graph that shows the relative area for the inside the box of different vegetation communities. So it's normalized for the changes in land area, so that it sums up to 1. And so again, we see really stable proportions of things like this is limestone feinboss, this is sandstone feinboss and sand feinboss. But we see this alternation. So like the big changes in this Middle Stone Age landscape for the people living here was that sometimes they had a lot of Renosterveld, lots of food plants. Sometimes they had a lot more grassland, C4 grasses that would have supported grazing ungulates. And so again, that difference is really dominated by the seasonality of the rainfall. So our coastal foraging ancestors, would have had, again, depending on the time period, the other landscapes that within range would have, in some cases supported good fuelwood production, in some cases good food plants, and in some places animal resources. So that's the story. And so as a group of scientists, we're really excited because now, with something like this, we can begin to ask questions and test hypotheses about how this environment specifically, drove human innovation, as in all humans, all our ancestors, and likewise how the people there might have affected the environment, but also as a group of humans who are descendant from the people who lived in the caves, which we all are, my colleagues and I, really feel a profound sense of joy coming home to where this environment allowed us to thrive. And this is this cave painting in ochre from Elands Bay, which is actually on the West Coast, is in ochre, and these are handprints. So these are literal handprints of our ancestors. So, quoting my friend Richard Cowling, all of us, because all of us came from here, are wired to appreciate biodiversity. We need to get that feeling back. We were absolutely dependent on this biodiversity, which is important to remember now in the face of environmental change, climate change. As he says, look after biodiversity and it's going to be okay. So I will conclude by again acknowledging that a very large group of colleagues have contributed to this work over the years. This is from our 2014 workshop. It still doesn't include everybody, but I at least wanted to point out, if you can't see him there in the back row, that Professor Eric Shook from the department that's hosting me today was part of that team then, and that's when we first met, actually. So I wanted to direct you to this great little documentary by the African Center for Coastal Paleosciences. It's 20 minutes long that talks about this project in a very visually compelling way, and you'll actually hear some of the people whose work I presented talk about it in their own words. So I want to thank you again for the honor of giving the Borchert Lecture and being part of the 100th anniversary speaker series, and happy to take questions.
Questions?
So the first question is looking at those handprints. What time period are those?
Those are actually much more recent.
Because we have them in Minnesota too.
Yeah. So those are not 90,000 years ago. The question was how old are the handprints? And I think that the date of those is not actually known, but it's quite that Elands Bay cave was excavated by another famous archaeologist who did find Middle Stone Age material, but no preservation of anything except lithics, no preservation of plants or animals because the chemistry of the sediment or whatever. But that site was again occupied in the Holocene right up to the very latest Holocene. And so those handprints might only be a few thousand years old. Yes.
So the vegetation reconstruction, so you didn't have pollen data,
Right.
and so they're not like a response service reconstruction. It's more like an IBIS-type model that you use for those, or.
So the question is about the vegetation model.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean the model was a decision rule, a decision rule based model where the decision thresholds for like if the seasonality of the rainfall is this % summer versus winter, you have and you're on shale, then it's Renosterveld. If it's this, those rules came from. Not from like fitting a statistical model, like what I usually do for my bread and butter species distribution modeling. It wasn't a statistical or machine learning model trained with contemporary patterns. It was based on contemporary patterns that plant ecologists have studied there, but the decision rules came from the literature. And so it was like looking through the literature and saying, if you're on shale and the rainfall is this amount and the seasonality is this, then it's this. And so when we used that model, we validated it by seeing if we could first reconstruct the modern, if we could construct basically the modern vegetation map.
So I guess the question is, you're taking as truth the assumption that the input about the seasonality of the rainfall is accurate based on a climate model?
Yes. So we are using the paleoclimate modeling, and assuming that our assumption is that the rainfall amount and the pattern of rainfall amount and seasonality that is shown by those paleoclimate models represents what really happened, and that it is of sufficient sort of resolution for our problem, which is always an issue. And I will say we validated it. We compared the vegetation patterns that we modeled with this paleoclimate data set to a very detailed paleoclimate model. Well, it was a regional climate model, so for you climate modelers will know the difference between a global climate model and a regional climate model. So there is a regional climate model that was calibrated and run for last glacial maximum. And actually Eric Shook was very involved in that because it required a lot of supercomputer time. and he played a really important role in that research. So that more detailed climate model reconstruction had been done for last glacial maximum. which, lots of people are interested in, but not us, because we're interested in this older time period that, which is much less studied and understood. But our modeling based on this coarse global climate model based on compared to the regional climate model for last glacial maximum matched up pretty well. The other sort of validation that we've done is if you add up all the vegetation for different time steps, those different vegetation types have different proportions of plants with C3 versus C4 photosynthetic pathways, and those do leave a proxy signal in paleoenvironmental work. So they leave, so if you have C3 or C4 plants at so C4 is really important because that's like those grazing grasses of the summer rainfall. So that's really important for grazing animals. C3s are all the shrubs and sort of everything else. So it's a pretty coarse classification, but it turns out to be pretty important in terms of human foraging and food. And you get a signal of carbon and oxygen isotopes that can get preserved in stalagmites and stalactites. So there's been some work there. Well, there's not a lot of great pollen. There's a lot of stalagmites and stalactites, and they've reconstructed or measured carbon and oxygen isotopes and related that to C3 versus C4 plants at a site, so you have a measure. And so it's pretty rough, but if we take our map and then take a circle around the site where the speleothem analysis was done and add up all the vegetation in there and then classify it as C3 versus C4, they follow each other pretty well. So again, it's, that's as much sort of validation as we have done so far. Yes.
I know a little climate, but not a lot. One thing that interested me, because I haven't seen it before, was the really smooth oscillation across thousands of years in that pattern of winter and summer rainfall. And I was curious if you could explain more how that works and why it's so smooth across such a long period of time. Or is that modeled, or is that confirmed by the climate record?
I think, most people don't, I think it's like maybe there's not a lot of, hopefully there's some climate people here who can help me out, I don't know where there are regions in the world where there's, in a fairly small area, you have this strong gradient or transition from winter rain to summer rain with an intermediate in the middle, and where that matters a lot in terms of the regional climate, right? And so to me it makes sense. It's like the world's getting warmer and colder, and not that much there, but in that region it's getting warmer and drier. But also, as you go from those, even if they're subtle, the glacials to the interglacials changes the sea level. And you're right at this confluence, as I understand it from the climate modelers, you're right at this confluence of these two ocean currents. So there's a lot going on. And as the sea level gets lower, again, you get more influence from the warm Agulhas current, and you get more summer rain. And so it does kind of make sense that as temperature, precipitation, and sea level fluctuate in those sort of understandable ways from the glacial, interglacial changes, that in that region you'd also get this fluctuation in summer versus winter rain right there at sort of the transition zone. I don't know if
I guess the fluctuation made sense, but the smoothness of it really was, it looked almost like a sine curve. Right?
Yeah,
you don't see that in the glacial, the ice, the warming.
I had to think about that. I'm not sure what is going on there.
As a wild guess, it might be the precession cycle of Earth orbit.
I don't know. We can try that, but yeah. There has to be maybe some smoothing going on because it's a percentage of the total, and the total changes, but.
Thank you.
Yes.
Have you been able to establish or find evidence of how this humanness was transmitted then north in this area? Was it by migration, genetic, or was it just cultural assimilation?
Well, I mean, I am not the right person to answer that question. So if there are any paleoanthropologists here, maybe you can help me out. My colleague, the principal investigator for Pinnacle Point, Dr. Curtis Marion, he knows all about this and would give it in probably his first lecture of the semester. But you know, it's known that there have, you know, probably during. I don't know if it corresponded to that. There seems to have been a bit of a genetic bottleneck at some point. It wasn't shown in that really generalized curve that we saw in the beginning. But for humans, and maybe it, you know, it corresponded to that a strong glacial at 160,000 years ago. And so there has been some speculation that maybe this was truly the refugia for humans, like all humans were only persisted there. Again, it's hard to say that when you haven't looked, you know, when you haven't found everything everywhere, or when there's differential, you know, it's harder to, stuff doesn't get preserved as well in the humid tropics. So, and there are now sites in, I think, Morocco that correspond to the same time period. Another Mediterranean ecosystem with winter rain transitioning to year-round on the other end of the continent. And so there might have not just been literally one refuge, and we're looking at it in that little box or in that region of South Africa. There may have been others. But during that entire time period, yes, we as humans were only in Africa, but we left Africa about 50,000 years ago.
Have you been able to get any genetic material from these people?
No, it's pretty ancient. So there's been, as far as I don't think so. Anybody else know? Yeah, I'm trying to think. There's no ancient DNA. Well, I mean, this was not that old, but Homo naledi is like 1 million or something. There's no DNA from that, right? So, yeah, it's. I think it's beyond the reach of ancient DNA. And in fact, in this particular site, there's interestingly very little human. You don't bury your ancestors where you live, right? So these are not burial sites. There are other caves where human remains have been found. The only human body parts they find in this cave are baby teeth. So, if you live somewhere, when kids lose their baby teeth, they end up in the back of the cave. So they do have human material, and now you've reached the limit of my knowledge of, what kind of information you can get directly from that. Oh, it's time. We need to let these people go.
Should we let Janet off the hook? So, all right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.